Well, moving along, South Africa has now entered the third phase of clinical trials for COVID-19 vaccine. The team of scientists leading this research are further testing the safety and effectiveness of the drug. 60,000 volunteers are expected to participate, with a significant number of people being over the age of 60. Now, the trial will also include those with or without comorbidities, with the latter being associated with an increased risk for progression to severe COVID-19. And to tell us more about all of this is Professor Linda-Gail Bekker, Deputy Director at the Desmond Tutu HIV Centre at UCT. Professor Bekker, good morning. Thanks so much for speaking to us.
Hi, Sakina. Always a pleasure.
So how significant is this stage of the trial?
Well, this is the stage that tells us whether the vaccine actually works or not, and that's obviously critical. Up until now, we've just been making sure that it's safe, but this phase of the trial is very important to, indicate whether it's going to be actually useful as a preventive measure. And so it's the kind of cherry on the top in the whole clinical development phase process.
Professor Bekker, when you test the safety of the vaccine, what factors are you actually looking into, especially at this stage?
Well, it's very important, first of all, that we want to make sure that any vaccine might create a little bit of reactogenicity. So the first thing we want to be sure of is that there isn't too much reactogenicity, because you can imagine if it makes people feel very unwell, or it's very painful, or they can't work for a number of days after having the vaccine, whilst it may work, people will be reluctant to use it. And so we want to first make sure it's tolerable, so it doesn't exceed the level of tolerability. But more importantly, we also want to make sure that there are no unexpected safety issues. And that's unlikely with vaccines. We don't see that too often. But, it's important we make sure that we don't see, for example, autoimmune disease, or that the vaccine causes some unexpected other problem that wasn't anticipated. And so you have to have numbers big enough to make sure that those rare events aren't happening, as well as making sure that the less problematic things are not so problematic that people won't want to use the vaccine. Remember, we're putting this into healthy people to prevent a problem. And so, it's important that it doesn't make people feel more sick in order to prevent that disease.
Prof, interestingly, people who are HIV positive and stable on medication are not excluded from participation in this trial. So how safe is it to take an experimental drug while on ARVs?
Well, I think it's important for us to find out that there aren't any untoward problems. Up until now, we would have looked to make sure that at least there were no drug interactions expected. And of course, ARVs and vaccines don't normally interact at a pharmacological level. So that's good news. But we also want to be sure that in this case, besides safety, that actually the vaccine is going to work in people who are also living with HIV. We know that HIV can have an impact on somebody's immune system, and therefore they may not have quite as good a response to a vaccine. And it's important that we find out if there are problems in a controlled, organized clinical trial environment before we unleash the vaccine, as it were, as rollout. And it's important in this country in particular that we're able to say to people, you too can participate in this vaccine and use it, even if you're living with HIV. We won't know that unless we test it under careful trial conditions. And so I'm very pleased that in this vaccine trial, because often, unfortunately, people living with HIV are excluded. They're seen to be non-healthy in a lot of trial eligibility criteria, and it means they get excluded, and therefore they don't they're not part of the process of understanding whether that medication or vaccine is safe for use in them. So this is important to do, and it's important to do under careful trial conditions.
Professor Bekker, there was, of course, earlier in the week, quite a bit of excitement around that announcement of the Pfizer vaccine. And, we saw the markets reacting this morning in our market indicators. We were talking about how the markets actually dipped following that particular announcement after certain considerations were expressed. But that Pfizer vaccine, how confident are you, and of course the medical fraternity as a whole, with regard to where that particular trial and vaccine is at? And it's said to be about 90% effective. What does that mean exactly?
Well, so this is the first thing, Sakina, to say is there are a number of vaccine candidates against COVID coming into phase 3 now. The importance of this announcement is the recognition that we can create a vaccine that is going to be effective against COVID. We hold our breath, as it were, to find that out. As you know, for 35 years, we've been looking for a vaccine for HIV, and we haven't yet had this level of indication that a vaccine can work in HIV. So in COVID, we've got an early signal that this is feasible and possible. Most of the vaccine candidates have also targeted a specific antigen called the spike on the virus, and it tells us that is a highly antigenic area, and so we're on to a good wicket, if you like. So this is really important news for the field. It doesn't mean we shouldn't stop looking for other vaccine candidates. And of course, there are still some unanswered questions about even this vaccine. For example, we don't know if it's going to work in, as we were just discussing, people whose immune systems may not be perfect. So older people, people with comorbid other problems or other conditions. And of course, we don't know anything about durability. So we don't know because it's very early. We've only known this result literally for a couple of days, and I'm sure the producers themselves are just finding this out. So durability is going to be the other big question. So I think great news, but not the full story, and there is still a lot to find out about this. But it does mean the field is energized because, we must continue the way we are going at the moment. So it's exciting.
Professor, I have so many questions, but we're out of time. So let me squeeze in 2 quick questions. Firstly, in terms of the next phase of your trial, if you can just briefly explain that to us, what's the next phase? And also, how close do you believe we are to completion? That's meant to be one question. And then the second question is, with the festive season coming up, there are, of course, concerns about another spike in infections in the country. What are your views on that?
So quickly to answer the first one, where the ensemble trial is also happening all around the world. So it's already recruiting in the north, and recruitment is going incredibly quickly. So that is very exciting. Pfizer, got to this point within weeks. So I think we're confident that South Africa can make a huge contribution here, but we need people to line up and volunteer. The trial will accrue as quickly as people will volunteer. There are a large number of clinical trial sites around the country. They're each coming into initiation now. And so we need to complete this clinical trial to know whether this candidate, using the AD26 vector, it's called the ensemble trial, whether that is going to be as successful as the Pfizer candidate. And of course, we're all holding thumbs for that. Around your second question, well, that needs a crystal ball, Sakina. But what we do know is that this virus is very transmissible. It likes to go from person to person where they are in close contact, where infectious people are mixing with susceptible individuals, and where ventilation is poor. So wherever people are going to be mixing with others who may be carrying the virus or infected with the virus, remember, we don't all show symptoms, then under those circumstances, we will see more transmission. So it's important for people to remember that as they go into the festive season and they start to congregate in perhaps less ventilated spaces, with the festivities, they are at risk of acquiring the virus. It is circulating still in this country. We need to keep that in mind and practice safe spaces, wear our masks, and take care not to become infected today. So this is the best advice that I can give to the country as we still go ahead and enjoy our summer, which of course is something we all want to do.
Professor Linda-Gail Bekker, always a pleasure, always informative speaking to you. Professor Bekker is the Deputy Director at the Desmond Tutu HIV Centre at UCT, talking to us about the third phase of the clinical trial for a COVID vaccine.